Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Adam Schuster. I'm one of the organizers with the MIT Enterprise Forum Northwest. I'm very happy to have you all at our book talk tonight. The MIT Club of Puget Sound is helping bring this to you, so special thanks goes to Lola Ball. And the MIT Enterprise Forum is a global organization with 25 chapters all over the world, each affiliated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology through MIT Technology Review. Our mission is to inform, connect, and prepare technology entrepreneurs to enable them to rapidly transform ideas into world-changing companies. The speaker tonight is our very own Jimmy Jia, chair of Seattle's Enterprise Forum chapter and CEO of Distributed Energy Management. He also teaches at Pinchot University, offering the Sustainable Energy Solutions Certificate to the next generation of business energy managers. The book he'll be discussing tonight is Driven by Demand, How Energy Gets Its Power. And tonight is a special event, but we're pleased to announce our next season, Transforming Tomorrow, where we'll be exploring 5 emerging and disruptive technologies. The themes for those events are augmented humans, interactive homes, nanotechnology, connected cities, and 3D bioprinting. The programs are made possible by our fantastic sponsors. We'd like to thank our Ruby sponsor, T-Mobile, and T-Mobile has also signed on to be our STEM sponsor, so we'll actually be bringing a lot of young people to the future events this year. Really happy about that. Artifact Group is our Emerald sponsor. And our program captain for this event is N-Wave Seattle, formerly known as Seattle Steam, so thank you very much. We also have some in-kind sponsorships from Freelock Computing, Puget Sound Video, and NetReflector. And I just also wanted to thank some of the volunteers that made this possible, Vicki Owens, Shirley Lundy, Paul Meehan, thank you very much. If any of you are interested in volunteering, please come see me or Cindy after Cindy who checked you in at the entrance afterwards. We'd love to have you guys be part of this. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that we are offering something brand new this year, which is a membership program. So in the past, we've sold tickets to each event individually, but now we are offering, and we will still do that, but you get quite a big discount if you order them, if you get an annual pass. The annual pass is just $50, and they include all 5 of the Innovation Forum events. So if you are interested in that, again, please see me or Cindy afterwards, and we'd be happy to set you up. Before we get to the event, I'm going to bring up John Boylan, who's going to talk to you just a little bit about our upcoming Augmented Humans event. John? Ah, there you are.
Hi, I'm John Boylan. I'm told I have 30 seconds, so I'll speak as quickly as possible. The featured speaker for your Augmented Humans session will be Thomas Duell. Thomas is a neuroscientist, neurologist, and sound artist who is working on a project where he's able to make music with his mind using an EEG and an interface with a MIDI controller. It's a fascinating project. Thomas will be a featured event at a project I'm spearheading called 9E2. And what that is an art and technology festival. It's happening in October, from October 21st to 29th. 17 installations, 11 performances, about a dozen speakers, all looking at the interface between art, science, and technology. And so check it out at 9e2seattle.com. I'll just say, someone told me that you guys would love this. One of the pieces is a dance performance looking at the questions of translating the language of calculus into the language of dance. So, without further ado, Jimmy.
I hope you don't expect me to dance to calculus tonight. That would be rather embarrassing. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for hosting me here tonight. It's great to be speaking on friendly turf. And also, this is quite interesting and different in terms of I usually have Adam's job of introducing the speaker, and usually right after that I make a beeline for the bar. And so unfortunately I won't be able to actually have a drink for probably another couple more hours, but that's okay. And a lot of people have asked me kind of what inspired me to write a book, and really what I got inspired to do was write a pamphlet, and it turned out the pamphlet turned out to be 300 pages long, and eventually got published. And so that was kind of an interesting experience, and hopefully next time I don't try to just write a pamphlet. But and a lot of my work, which is what we're going to talk about today, is looking at this intersection of energy and the outcomes that it provides for us in the world. Because after all, we're just sitting here, and energy provides us with a lot of great benefits. It provides us the light bulbs that's overhead and the light bulb that's in the projector. But at the same time, energy and the outcomes can also be abused. And one great way of using it is death by PowerPoint. So now you guys are here for another 2.5 hours. We're going to have some fun. But really, if we start thinking about what are these outcomes that we care about, we can start asking the question is, well, what is a business doing? A business always have to have a minimum viable product. If we go back to business school language, it has to have a reason, a customer need that it solves. So what's the customer need that energy is solving? And today we're going to talk about a number of them. We're going to talk about what that product is, first of all, before we start talking about some of the applications. And then we're going to look at the issues of things like resilience. We're going to look at the issues of things like how do we manage these resources? We're going to look at costs, and we're going to look at optimizing assets. But each one of these are really much more about the outcome of what energy provides, much more about that customer benefit, rather than just looking at it from a supply side point of view. After all, businesses are there to meet customer needs. To begin this story, though, we kind of have to go back in time, and we're going to start in the 1300s. And in the 1300s, someone came up with an idea of putting wooden tracks along a road and getting some horses to pull it. And that was basically the advent of the railway. But every time an innovation happened, it was really at some intersection of two different infrastructures, because just that railway by itself that was run by horses wasn't quite enough. But after several centuries, something new came up simultaneously, which was the steam pump. And the steam pump was invented to pump water out of mines. No one was thinking about putting it into something that was mobile. And James Watt eventually minimized that steam pump enough such that it was actually something you can move around. But even then, it took a long time, another century or so, or about another 30 years or so, before the Watt steam engine became mobile and someone put it onto the railroad track, right? And then even then, once we got to the steam locomotive, it took another century and another infrastructure called the light bulb, which was invented in 1802 by Humphrey Davy, perfected by Edison for sure, before Edison built his first electric power plant on Pearl Street in Manhattan in 1882. And so each one of these innovations that have happened is really sitting at the intersection of two different infrastructures. And so we're going to start the rest of our story in 1890, when the first electric grid was getting built. And we can ask the question, what were they trying to solve? The International Niagara Falls Competition and Commission was set together to help the Niagara Falls Power Company build the first major transmission line. So what were they actually trying to solve? The problem's actually pretty straightforward. Niagara Falls is located in the village Niagara, town of 5,000, and there weren't enough customers to actually consume all the energy that they were going to generate. So they needed to move that power to a completely different center, which was the city of Buffalo down here, at a distance of 18 miles. And the state gave them a mandate that they had to move 100,000 horsepower from Niagara Falls all the way over into the city of Buffalo. Well, this doesn't seem like a very big distance to us today, obviously. But there's a very interesting thing that I love about this, which is look at the unit of what they were actually mandated. They were trying to move 100,000 horses. How many of us think of what's coming out of our out of our electrical socket today as horses, right? But really, that's what the grid was built. How do you move 100,000 horses from the village of Niagara to the city of Buffalo? Well, if we think about that as the problem statement, there's actually many different ways we can move 100,000 horsepower. The city of Paris, for instance, for 20 or 30 years had a pneumatic mail delivery system. Think of Costco and all those tubes that are going back and forth. Think of that the size of Paris. And they had that for many, many years already. And that was a proven, known way to move energy, to move power. The city of Zurich and Belgrade had what was called telodynamics, or a system of wire ropes, pulleys, levers, and gears. So think of the cable cars in San Francisco, and think of that for 4 miles along the Rhone River before it reached the center of town in Zurich to run the factories that were of the day. We could move 100,000 horsepower that way, too. Or we can think of the customer need on the other side. Most factories in Buffalo ran off of steam and hot air and just that pressure. So why don't we deliver them the product they would have to generate themselves anyways? So why don't we transmit steam for 18 miles from the city of Buffalo, from Niagara Falls to the city of Buffalo? That would certainly solve the problem too. And that is also a proven technology for 20, 30 years. Or this little city called Portland built an electrical transmission line that was 14 miles long over the Willamette Falls to power some electric streetcars in downtown Portland. But unfortunately, this infrastructure, it got washed away in the winter storm and only lasted 9 months. So in 1890, this was the situation. A pneumatic system that's 1 or 2 miles in diameter, a wire rope system that could transmit about 4 miles, a steam system, which is what they cared about, or this new dinky technology that no one knew really worked or not. If you were running a utility and you were trying to make a long-term, multi-million-dollar investment, which technology would you choose? It's actually not that clear, right? Well, obviously today we know what they chose. And not only did they chose electric transmission of power, but they also chose the AC version of that electric transmission of power, which itself is an incredibly wonderful and long story. But the power plants that ended up getting built on Niagara Falls ultimately did solve that problem, transmitting 100,000 horses from Niagara Falls 18 miles to the city of Buffalo. So fast forward 120 years to today, this is the form factor that we now interact with the grid. Are we getting horses or are we getting electrons? What are we actually buying? What's the product? And the first indication that I always like to start with of what is it that we're actually buying is to look at something that we all recognize, which is just this little bugger right here. I don't know how many of you have paid attention, but there's a lot of symbols, numbers, and items on there, and it tells you exactly what it is that we're buying. And if you're like me, you'll spend an entire weekend just trying to figure out what all those things mean. And it turns out that most of those symbols and diagrams are safety standards. And the safety standards vary by your country. And so some of these are for the US, some are for Europe, some are for Japan, for Denmark, for Netherlands, et cetera, or Norway, et cetera. But effectively, what it's telling me is I'm buying something that won't electrocute myself. That's a pretty good thing, buying something that's safe. There's a couple of symbols that talks about the environmental concerns. And so the trash can means I can't throw this away into the normal trash in the US. The rose compliance mean that this is lead-free in Europe. And the 10 with the circle means it's electronically recyclable in China. So, okay, great. I'm buying something that's telling me how I need to dispose of this after the fact. Well, being an engineer, I like numbers. And there's only one little corner of this thing that actually has some numbers. And those numbers say these things. 60 hertz, 120 volts, 2 amps, and then it has a little squiggly line, which means AC. And what comes out on the other side is 19 volts, 3.42 amps, and then that little symbol means DC. Okay, so great. These are the numbers. Where on these specs does it say I consume energy? Am I actually consuming energy? I mean, for sure, I can go and do my calculations and work out the energy that is actually getting consumed based on combining the voltage and the amperage. But does this thing care about the energy, or does it care how that electron is getting delivered to me? In essence, the infrastructure of what's behind the work, behind the scenes, so that I can have 60 hertz, so that I can have 120 volts. And if we start thinking about, well, wait a minute, I don't care just to get an electron. I actually care how that electron gets to me. Now we're asking a slightly different question of what that product is that we're consuming. And ultimately, this comes into that difference between energy and power. Are we consuming energy or are we consuming power? Those are two very different products. Typically speaking, the relationship of energy power is an equation. The relationship is based on time. Power is just energy over time. Traditionally, the way that we can describe it is to say, well, energy is kind of like a lake of water. It just sits there, but by itself, energy has really no value. It's only when we turn it into something that's moving does it actually have value. And so depending on the size of the dam will tell me how much power is actually going to be extracted from that body of water, right? And so I have to put some sort of a work, some sort of motion into that energy in order to turn it into a power. Well, we can look at more of the formal definitions. Energy means an ability to do work, and power means a rate to do work. And they answer two slightly different questions, right? Energy says, how much water do I have inside of my tank? And power says, how fast is that water flowing? But I like to put it in terms of business terms. Energy is basically saying I'm buying electrons, and power is saying I'm buying electrons when I need it. I'm buying electrons on demand. And so let's think about that now. When I plug my laptop into the wall, when I turn on the lights, and when I'm trying to run that projector, do I care that I'm buying electrons, or do I care I'm buying electrons on demand? And as we all know from kind of internet content and just media, those are two very different products that is being sold, which means those have two different prices and two different infrastructures that are required to be able to deliver. Okay, so first of all, the product that we are buying is actually power. We care about the electrons on demand. We don't really care about the electrons. There's actually, if we think about it and move fast forward a little bit into renewable energy, there's actually a problem with renewable energy just by the word. Renewable energy gives us energy, but is this what I'm actually buying when I plug myself into a wall? No. What I actually care about is renewable power, yet we don't actually talk about that as a conversation point. And this is why issues like intermittency come up. This is why energy storage becomes important, because once we add renewables with storage, we now have renewable power. Renewable energy itself actually doesn't solve any of the problems because that's not what we're buying in the first place. Well, now that we know what the product is, let's look at how we can make that product helps our resiliency. And with resiliency, I want to start the story with Hurricane Sandy. In 2012, one of the major hurricanes went through the eastern seaboard, knocked out electricity to about 6 million people, killed over 200, caused the $75 billion worth of damage up the entire East Coast. It was a pretty big disaster. A lot of Manhattan was dark. And if we look at aerial views pre and post, you see a lot of the eastern seaboard in New Jersey, Long Island, and New York City just basically go black. One of the interesting things about this story, though, is that all of the communities that had cogeneration or district heating, thermal power, never lost electricity during the entire time. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, let's look at what heat is. And to start with heat, I want to go to this graph, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory flow of energy. Now, I have to admit, this is my most favorite graph in the world. If this is not your most favorite graph, it should be your most favorite graph in the world. Go look this up online, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory energy flow diagram. It is everywhere. Primarily because it's too small probably for you guys to see the words on it at this point, so go find it on your iPhones. But the reason why this is so important is it is an energy balance of the country, and it shows us what comes in must go out. And we can do a great accounting to know how this energy is flowing through the entire country. And so we can see solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, all the way down to petroleum. We can see how electricity generation, which is that orange box, is able to take in fuel sources from all different energy sources. And we can see petroleum mostly goes to feed transportation over there. And we also see then electricity goes to run the residential sector, the commercial sector, industrial sector, and then the darker gray is all of the great energy services and benefits that we can enjoy. But what's the lighter gray? The lighter gray is rejected energy. It's wasted energy. We can call it pollution. And generally speaking, the form of wasted energy, rejected energy, is in the form of heat. So if we think about it, electric generation over here is kind of a common denominator of the supply side, because I can take any fuel source and turn it into electricity. Well, heat is actually a common denominator on the other side, the waste side, because every form of energy eventually becomes heat. So what if I'm able to manage both the electricity side? Why don't I also go and manage the heat side on the other side? Would there be a benefit to do that? Well, let's first think about how we consume energy inside of a facility. And this is a breakdown of a typical home in the US. 41% is heating my space, 18% to heating my water, 6% to cooling my water, and then the rest of it is left to run my iPhones, my computers, and my little electronic devices. So it turns out that about 65% of what we consume on a regular basis has to do with heating. Well, if that's the case, then why am I generating electrons? And in a power plant, I take fossil fuel chemical energy, 33% of it becomes electric energy, and then I throw away the others because I don't want the heat. And then I take that 33% and I convert 60% of that back into heat. Does that make any sense at all? Well, why do we do that? Well, in the US, what we've done is we've built our power plants outside of city cores. So we can capture the electrons, but we can't capture the heat. And if we can't capture the heat, we can't really do anything with it. We can't transport that heat as easily as we can transport electricity. And so comes the idea of cogeneration. If we can generate both heat and capture that heat and use that heat at the same time, then maybe instead of using this to run 60% of my home, I can use that useful heat, the waste heat, to run 60% of my home. And if we go to Europe, what we see is they build their power plants in downtowns. This is actually the municipality of Monaco. And the palace is just right off of the image. Downtown is not too far away. They not only capture the electricity and use the electricity to run their devices, they also capture the heat to run most everything else that they actually need to do. And if you do this, you can see an immediate savings on the efficiency of how we utilize that fuel. And it's not just Monaco, it's a lot of cities. Copenhagen is probably the furthest along in terms of the development of heat resources. The yellow spots is where they use steam, and the red and blue spots are where they use hot water at different temperatures and different pressures. But because heat is transferable in so many ways, not only do homes and consumers extract the heat when they need it, but factories, which also have a lot of waste heat, are able to take that and feed it back into the system too. So it's not just about now the power plants generating the energy and putting it into the system, but end consumers can also generate their own as a byproduct and put it back into the system too. And so, ultimately when we think about managing our heat, that has a huge impact on our resource mix. And so in Denmark, because they value heat and because they capture them and put it back into the system, their fuel mix for running that system is incredibly different. Back in the 1980s, it was over 80% fossil fuels. Now it's almost just 50%. And they're able to reduce that and integrate renewables because now they have two levers to play with. They can play with electrons and they can play with heat. And depending on how they need to integrate and how they need to keep the grid balanced, they can use both resources. And that increases the real resilience of the entire system, putting those two together. Well, if we start thinking about this now, what we're talking about are basically completely different resources that we can use to start managing together. And so for this next section, I want to talk about managing resources and what's a best way to demonstrate resources but to talk about trash. After all, trash is just the end of a resource life cycle. We start with these resources inside of a mine, we take them out of the ground, we manufacture with them, we process them, we put them into our grocery stores, our retail stores, we buy them, once we use them, we throw them away. 95% of everything we buy gets thrown away at one point or another. It doesn't matter if it's the cup that you use to drink a glass of wine, or the piano. At some point, each one of those is going to get thrown away. And so then we can start thinking about, well, what's the resource mix? What's the materials mix of this entire supply chain? And for the US, municipal solid waste, what we consider trash is technically called municipal solid waste, looks something like this. Huge amount of paper, food, wood products, yard trimmings, etc., a little bit of glass and textiles, and the metals themselves break down primarily to steel, a little bit of aluminum, and then odds and ends of the other metals in the periodic table. But this is what it looks like. And typically speaking, we take this, and once it goes through our system of getting disposal, yeah, we recycle, and yeah, we do a lot of other stuff. About 50% still ends up in a landfill. Anyone know how long a landfill lasts for? Centuries? We don't know yet. Yeah, it's a good question. So there's this thing that archaeologists like called middens, if anyone's here is an archaeologist. And a midden is basically a rubbish heap, which is incredibly valuable to archaeologists because it shows the habits of what that civilization does. A typical one is around 9,000 years old. The longest one on record is 140,000 years old, found in South Africa. And the interesting thing is most of these are made out of shells and other organics and other biomaterials. So biomaterials last for about 140,000 years inside of a landfill. How long do you think our stuff will last inside of a landfill? So it'll be there for a while, right? For all practical purposes, it will be there permanently. Well, that's probably not a good thing. And one of the things that Germany did was they really focused on that. And they said, look, this is not just a hazard to us today, but it's a hazard to our future, especially if we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years. We're not just talking about the next generation or two. And so they made a concerted effort to eliminate landfills. And what we see is they did a pretty darn good job. They went from 43% landfilled in the 1990s to less than 1% landfilled in 2010. And this is of municipal solid waste. Well, we didn't do too bad. We went from 70 to 54. We should be proud of ourselves, right? But how were they able to get from 43% to less than 1%? That's rather significant. Well, that's because they realized this wasn't just trash. This just wasn't something that you throw away. This was a valuable resource that you had to go and try to somehow capture. And so they created a prioritization method. And they made producers be the ones to help fund this. Because after all, if you're producing it, you should be responsible for the disposal of it. That was their logic. And so the beginning of their waste management system was to avoid having to buy it in the first place. So if you don't need it, why should you buy it? And if you don't buy it, then it never ends up in the waste in the first place. That's probably the best place to start. Well, once you have to buy something, why don't you buy something that lasts a long time and is pretty darn good? Well, in that case, it'll take a lot longer before it actually ends up in the landfill, right? Once you do that and you've used it for the useful life that you can, why don't you use it for something else? If you can use it for something else, once again, that diverts it from a landfill. It isn't until step 5 that we start talking about recycling. When do we start talking about recycling here in the US? It's like the only thing we do, right? But yet there, it's not until the 5th. And after we recycle, unfortunately, not everything is infinitely recyclable. Glasses and most metals are, but paper lasts about 5 to 7 times before it's just cardboard and the fibers are not usable anymore. And plastics, typically 1 to 2 times recycled before you can't reprocess it again. So once something is not recyclable, instead of just throwing it away and burying it out of sight, what they do is they extract the embodied energy out of the material through an incineration process. And once they extract the embodied energy out, the leftover is ash. And by the time you put ash into a landfill, it's inert, and its volume is much smaller, and it's not going to cause the various harmful chemical effects anymore. And so it's not to say that we want to go and burn all of our trash. No, we want to start and not have to use it in the first place. But each one has their place in the cycle, and each one has a reason for being there. And you should only do each one after you've done all the other things that are a little bit higher priority. And when you do things this methodically, yes, we can also get from 40% or 50% in this country down to less than 1% consumption by being strategic about how we minimize that particular outcome. Well, if we can do this for trash, can we do this for another resource? Why don't we choose a random one like carbon? Can we create a strategy for prioritizing the elimination of carbon? Well, why not? It starts with avoiding using carbon in the first place. So why don't we live next to where we work? Why don't we live next to where we have to go to school and go shopping and do retail and avoid the need of having to consume carbon in the first place? And after we do that, that includes passive housing, but once we do that and we have to use energy, well, let's use energy efficiently. And once we use energy efficiently, let's go and manage our wasted energy. And once we do that, then let's start talking about generating renewable power. And note, I've put renewable power, not renewable energy. But let's not talk about generation until we've done all this other stuff first, right? And only at the very end should we talk about sequestration, because that's just really cleaning up messes that we've already made. But if we don't make the mess in the first place, then sequestration itself just really becomes an afterthought. So, how do we make all of this work? And how do we continuously lower costs? So the next section I want to talk about, how do we keep costs low? Going back to the theme of this talk, a lot of these innovations are happening at these intersection of infrastructure, right? And so I just want to demonstrate a couple of these innovations that are happening. They should be relatively apparent. You put electricity with a car and you get the Tesla, electric vehicles. Huge disruption in those two sectors. You put an airplane and agriculture together, and what you get is aviation biofuels. You get the ability now to fly planes using a fuel source that is more renewable than Jet A fossil fuels, Jet A grade diesel. And in fact, today you have biofuels that are now just drop-in for Jet A. And I know there have been demonstration flights that have just been 100% fossil fuel, 100% biofuels. The biggest disruptor, though, of any of these infrastructures is the internet and the digitalization of just information. And so you get things like the Amazon Dash, where you click a button and Tide shows up in an hour. Well, that's basically just taking that supply chain and disrupting it with the internet, but that itself has an energy infrastructure consequence, right? And if we look at the internet, it has disrupted so many things. You look at Google and the autonomous vehicle, you look at John Deere and self-driving tractors, and just FYI, John Deere came up with the self-driving vehicle about a decade before Google even started. And so that tractor, for instance, doesn't have a driver in it, and most of these are basically also run by GPS. The one that I want to focus a little bit on is when we put the internet and merge it with the electric grid. What's going to happen? Well, we start seeing it today. For one thing, we can't think about it as an electric grid anymore, and we can't think about it as an internet anymore. The two infrastructures are basically merged, and they're one cyber-physical infrastructure. After all, can you run a power plant without computers? Can you run computers without electricity? So if you can't run one of the infrastructures without the other, the two are basically a single infrastructure now. And so we have to start talking about cyber-physical. And we're not going to talk about today when we talk about security. We can't just talk about cybersecurity. We can't just talk about physical security. There's now this new emerging field of cyber-physical security, of how one is interacting with the other. Well, why is the smart grid, though, so exciting? And why is it so exciting to people in the field as we go out into energy? Well, once again, we have to go back into a history lesson, and it all started in 1914 with a gentleman called Samuel Insull, CEO of the Chicago Edison Company. He was private secretary to Edison himself, and his big insight was he realized that he didn't need as much fuel to serve all of his clients. You see, he had a neighborhood in Chicago which required 94 kilowatts of load to be able to serve. And he realized that if he engineered things just right, all he needed was a 29 kilowatt transformer to be able to serve 94 kilowatts of load at a third of the resources, essentially, that all of his competitors were trying to do. How was he able to do that? Well, it turns out it's something called load diversity. And load diversity is just a fancy name for saying not everyone turns on their lights at the same time, right? And if people are using that load at different times of the day, for different purposes, at different places, what he realized was he could serve a larger community even though he was using less resources and fewer resources to be able to satisfy their need. And so for him, what that meant was the larger area that you can get and the more information you could have flowing back and forth of where that load was going, the better you can optimize your resources and the fewer resources you need to be able to serve those customers. Now, back in his day, real-time information was sending a guy on a horse buggy to be able to go look at something, whereas today we have synco phasers that are pinging back and forth to a control room at sub-second intervals. And so in essence, our information has become wealthier, and because of that information, we can do a lot more fancy things and a lot more fancy stuff to balance out the grid. One of the big challenges that the grid is facing today is something called the duck curve. And it's called the duck curve primarily because that dotted line up there, an engineer thought looked like a duck. And the duck curve is created as an artifact of solar. You see, the dark black line up on top is the projection of how much load the state of California will need over a 24-hour period. The light gray line down here that looks like a hump is the projection of the solar energy that's going to be dumped onto the grid during the day. Well, as the utility and as the grid operator, they're responsible for making sure that you have that 24-hour access to your power, right, to your horses that are getting delivered. But yet, if there's a giant dip in the middle of the day, how can that utility go and satisfy your customer need? You can't turn on and off a coal-fired power plant. That takes 8 to 24 hours. And so we can't satisfy this just by the methods that we have today. We have to look at how can we more strategically and smartly connect load to source, to sinks in a creative way such that it's not just me selling it's not the utility selling me power, but maybe I have a couple of solar panels that are going back and forth between my neighborhood, or that electric grid, the solar farm down there, or a wind farm somewhere else basically helps manage all that stuff out. But we need to know how we can route that energy back and forth across all these different end users and providers. And the internet is going to help us be able to manage all of that. And so the more that we can have real-time information and the more that we can understand this diversity of load, the more we'll be able to keep prices down. And the reason why we can do that is this diversification of load has worked for the last 40, 50 years to, in effect, keep electricity at the exact same cost that it has been over time after inflation adjustments. Sure, the nominal rate has gone from 2 cents to over 10, but what other product has stayed exactly the same price for 50 years? And this has happened because of load diversification, because of understanding how to route energy and much better real-time information that goes around. Before we move on, I want to the last topic, I want to do a quick recap. We've looked at intersecting infrastructures, and we talked about a couple of these different outcomes, starting from defining what the product is, looking at resiliency, managing resources, lowering costs. But kind of the hidden theme that I want to highlight a little bit is each one of these has been a story about a slightly different infrastructure, right? We started with a story about Niagara Falls, which was really a story about the electric infrastructure. And once we took the electric infrastructure and we added heat to the story, then we got resilience. And then once to that story, we added waste and we got resource management. Because actually, that power plant I pointed out in Monaco, that was a waste incinerator where you can capture the heat as well as you can capture the electrons. And then after we talked about waste, if we add internet to all of those things, now we start looking at diversification of load and how to manage and balance things between all of these infrastructures. And so the last infrastructure I want to add for tonight before we go into Q&A is finance, money. And when we do that, we can start thinking of energy as an asset. There's a lot of reasons why I want to end with finance, one of which is because energy and finance are intimately tied. And the second one thing is it actually, I think, gives an idea of what we can do as individuals as we go off after this talk. Certainly, the intersection of energy and finance is incredibly tightly bound as well. I mean, how many of you guys have pension funds? How many of your pension funds invest in utilities? Why do pension funds like investing in utilities? They have a consistent return, right? Well, let's think about that. If you're investing in a utility and you value that consistent return, what's the role of that utility? Is it to provide you renewable power, which is risky, or is it to provide you consistent returns, which is very boring? But yet, I'd like to retire at some point. Well, we can look at this as the Dow Jones Industrial Index and the Dow Jones Utility Index. And the last 12 months, the utility index is in red. It has outperformed the Dow Jones Index. And so it just kind of goes to show that the utilities are pretty steady on the finance side. But if we look at it internally to a company, let's go back to the outcomes. Why do companies consume energy? Ultimately, it's to provide outcomes, right? The outcome could be thermal comfort. If we're sitting here inside the room, it could be the convenience of delivering Tide. It could be the security, resilience, all these things that we've talked about. And if we think of how a company does that today, well, certainly there's operational costs. You got to pay your bills. But at the same time, if all I care about is that I'm comfortable inside of this room, there's many ways I can provide that comfort, just like there's many ways I can transmit a horse. I can rent that comfort from a utility by plugging a heater into the wall, or I can buy that comfort by insulating my windows and not have to have a lot of heat leak out. Well, ultimately, if those are two methods to provide thermal comfort, that is now all of a sudden an asset allocation decision, right, of how I spend my money. Do I spend my thermal comfort in an operational way, or do I spend my thermal comfort in a capital way? So obviously, capital costs are part of my utility budget. External incentives, all those efficiency incentives and tax rebates and manufacturer rebates to get me to buy better equipment, that's part of my utility budget. And what the EPA estimates is because all these things are managed separately within an organization and in different departments, we waste about 30% of our energy. Well, I mean, who would like, if you spend $1 million on utilities, what that means is you're wasting 300,000 of it. So that's why I put this bottom thing. We're also actively allocating 30% of all these to waste. Think about that. We're getting comfort and we're spending all of this money. Wouldn't it be nice to get rid of that bottom thing, which is 30% of our consumption? Let's look at some, how we make these decisions, because all these decisions not only affect different departments, but they also affect different timescales. Some decisions I need to make right now on an hourly timescale or even minute-by-minute timescale, even in the utilities are making decisions on sub-second timescales. But if, tactically, I just got to do what I got to do to sell more widgets today or produce more goods tomorrow. And so I'm making those decisions on a regular basis, but productivity ties directly to my energy consumption. And then in the meanwhile, on kind of the days and month time frame, I'm going to be looking at maintenance schedules. I got to have a facilities department that's making sure everything's running properly. And then sure, on the year-long time scale, I'm going to be looking at capital purchases, trying to figure out ROIs and understanding how are my investments going to come back into my asset value of the physical infrastructure. But then yet the utility has also given me a lot of options too. In some markets, not here, we can do demand response, which is basically the utility paying you not to consume energy for a while. That way they can keep the grid balanced. But then other things like time of use, which just simply means over the course of the day, I know my cost is going to be different based on that, the usage curve. And so maybe that way, me as a factory, I will just simply schedule my production at a different time, right? And that'll help move the peaks as well. And then when a utility invests in energy efficiency, they're really looking at the years. Usually the typical utility calculation of efficiency is 7 years long. But it's not just about the energy. People today are now realizing that it's a competitive advantage to do things that's green. It's a competitive advantage to sell products that are sustainable. So if you do the bottom stuff well, that's actually new products that I can go and sell. And some companies who own solar panels and run data centers justify that they are selling carbon-free data storage. That's a huge differentiator if you think about it. And then it goes into environmental strategy. But basically, each one of these have a different rhythm, a different time scale that they work on. Who's managing all of this today? Is there anyone? It's tough. And so one of the things that we've been working on, that I've been working on, is this notion of actually, if we track the evolution of the utility grid, it tracks relatively linearly with the evolution of the internet. And the internet today has something called the Chief Information Officer, so we've proposed something called the Chief Utility Officer. Now this is really why, because back in the early days of information, it was a much more transactional situation. You had one supplier, which was called IBM. And if you had only one supplier, you really needed only one person inside of your company that knew how to buy from them, and so you can put an engineer on that job, and they just every 10 years would buy something new from IBM. Well, then came PCs, and all of a sudden, anyone could buy, well, department heads can now start buying PCs, and there were a couple more suppliers, HP and Dell, and IBM was in there, and Gateway. And so now you needed someone to coordinate those activities, and so you put it together into a director of IT. Then came the internet. And not only are we talking about computers, but phones and subscriptions. Should I use Salesforce or Oracle or SAP, or how should I? And there's so many freeware, et cetera. Well, that role of managing digital information is no longer just buying from IBM, but it has become of strategic importance for the success of that business. And like I said, we see very similar tracks to how that's evolving inside of utilities. In the past, all we did was just pay the bill, and that's all we had to care about. But today, we're starting to get some complexity. I can buy a renewable bond if I really want to be able to say I have money and a stake in the renewable game. I can go and buy energy efficiency. I can go buy a solar panel. I can go buy this, and I can buy that. And so those decisions are becoming a little bit more complex. And as we get into more complexity of understanding what does that mean into sustainability, what does that mean into information management system, what does that mean into employee health, that gets incredibly many more decisions are interacting with this energy sector, utility sector, and so that's why we started calling a chief utility officer. And so some of my students put this together for a term project, but they really started to break down, well, what is this role of this person? And it's someone that sits within the role of the office of the CFO, helping them make much better strategic decisions of how they're wasting their 30% of utilities. And 30% is quite significant. If we think about it from a cash flow point of view, for one of our clients, it was enough to take a couple hundred more homeless people off of the streets. And when we start thinking about how that utility cost and that utility waste could enable the client to be better for their mission and vision, that has a pretty large impact. But even if we think about it from a pure financial point of view, reducing that 30% dramatically changes the profit margin of the business. Look at the 30% waste. We spend $155 billion a year in the commercial sector on just electricity. So when you start adding natural gas and water and waste and sewage and all the other utilities, those numbers become incredibly large. And then just think, what's 30% of that? That's what we're wasting as a country on an annual basis. And, if we're able to do this, one of the great things of strategically being able to go in and make these small modifications is you don't have to have a large impact on an annual basis. What matters is the fact that you sustain it over time. And so if we're able to make a 3% improvement every single year on utility consumption, which does not sound like a lot, it's highly doable, 3% reduction consumption every year. But if we can do that in a way that we tailor it that improves the business, and if we do it consistently year over year over year, in 12 years, 3% compounds to a 30% reduction in energy, which is basically an elimination of that waste. You want to do it faster? Spend more money. Let's move it forward. You want to do it slower? Well, okay, that's fine too. But this is now part of that asset allocation game. And so just think about that. We could, in a strategic and prioritized way, be able to put all of that together. So thank you very much for the talk. Feel free to, happy to answer questions. This is kind of the general thing. And we'd appreciate it if you could come up to one of the two microphones. That way we can record them in the back. Go ahead.
This was a little vague. Maybe you could walk us through an example of a company you've worked with and how you went through and optimized their energy use?
Yeah, sure. So it's a rather simple process. The first thing we do when we walk into a business is try to understand the outcome, the mission and the vision of what that company is trying to accomplish. So sometimes that's serving the homeless, sometimes that's serving more customers, sometimes that's profit margin, whatever. Because at the end of the day, we ask the question of, hey, if you could capture that 30% waste, what would you put it towards? And if you can put that money towards that outcome, how can we help you make energy investments that drive towards that future goal? So first thing is we have to set a vision. The second thing is then we start looking at what's broken. The most effective way of becoming more energy efficient is to fix what's broken. And so then we just basically start going down a list of priorities of how we can identify things to do. The first thing you do, fix what's broken. Second thing, you fix things that will break soon. Third things is, and then until you understand the life cycle of the equipment inside of that entire the business. And it could be a single standalone building, or it could be a business with many hundreds of buildings. It doesn't matter, because what you're doing, you're trying to prioritize eliminating the waste. And the first place to eliminate waste is broken equipment. And so then once we start doing that and we give them a list of priorities, then we get it more to the financial side. We help them set the money aside. We help them manage the budgets. We help them get financial incentives, loans, et cetera. We help them do technology selection and much more of that lining things up. But once you clean all that up and you put them all into a nice, concise report, now it becomes much easier to make those decisions, to be able to understand, well, gosh, I now know my hot water heater needs to be replaced in 3 years. Why don't I start, A, setting aside money today, and B, why don't I figure out what alternatives I have when I have to replace it with, so that way when a hot water heater breaks, I'm not scrambling trying to buy the cheapest thing on the market, but I'm trying to buy one that actually makes my company better. Does that answer your question? Okay. Go ahead, Grace.
Bear with me because I'm still formulating this question, but
Uh-oh.
you talked about the example that if I could rent the power and plug in my heater, or I could invest in the capital and put insulation on the windows so less heat is escaping. I'm from the Sunshine State, although I live in Seattle now. But every day the sun rises in Florida and the sun sets, and there's an asset of energy that goes to waste.
Yep.
How does that factor into this demand management energy model that you're discussing, or does it? Is there any?
The place that I always start is what's the outcome that I care about, not what's the supply that I care about.
Okay.
Ultimately, we're trying to solve consumer demand, and ultimately, we're trying to solve a customer problem. And so if there's no customer problem, why should I worry about that in the first place?
Right.
So let's figure out what the customer problem is. Well, we got to run cities. We got to run cities during the day. We got to have electrons in this particular voltage and those sorts of things. Then the next question is, what's the best way for me to provide that? I want to look at solar to be able to see if I can provide that. But I also want to look at all of my alternatives of what's the best way to provide that. And then we can start making the decision what's the best way to provide that, right? And so, yes, that's a huge amount of energy that's available. Is it the right type of energy to be able to put into the system?
Right.
And those are questions that we need to start asking,
Yes.
right? To be able to connect the dots between what's available and how we actually consume it.
Right. So, okay, that helps me a lot because I think about transportation all the time.
Yep.
And many times in transportation, people are like, oh, the autonomous vehicle is going to be the next thing. But in my mind, it's just one of the tools from which we use to solve whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve
Absolutely.
for. So,
Yeah,
okay.
autonomous vehicles is a great technology. What's the problem that it solves?
Yep. Okay.
In fact, one of the, just out of curiosity, I just did a quick calculation that I put in the book. It was just kind of a thought experiment, but let's hypothetically, like these intersections of infrastructures create futures that we can't predict. So we have the autonomous vehicle.
Yeah.
It's great Because after all, you can get into it and show up at your appointment or whatever, which means you can read a book, which means you can take a nap, which means you can make a phone call, you can do all different sorts of things in it. But there's also people working on really efficient and effective cars. So I use the example of a 100-mile-per-gallon automobile. We can do that. We can engineer an automobile that uses 100 miles, drives 100 miles per gallon. Well, if we use, I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, but if we use just $4 per gallon as an average fuel cost, it is actually cheaper for me to sleep in my car for 8 hours and drive on the highway than it is to rent a hotel, or it is even cheaper than a nightly stay inside of a dorm room at UW. Well, if you're a university student on a tight budget and you realize that buying gas and driving around in a 100-mile-per-gallon car is cheaper than renting a dorm room, what do you think you're going to do? Right? So it's really hard to predict the future if we look at it from the technology side or the supply side. We have to look at the outcome of what is it that we're actually trying to optimize for, and then we can understand what is the infrastructure that's going to be created to be able to make that outcome happen. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to know, how do you convince like a landlord or somebody who's renting out equipment or space to improve their infrastructure when really, I mean, what's the incentive?
Yeah. What's the incentive of a landlord to improve a building? Well, let's start with outcomes. That is the first question I always like to ask for these sort of questions, or when trying to think about it, is who's the person that actually controls that decision, right? And the best way to find that is actually just to chase the money. If you start going down the money trail and you can find the person that actually cares about who benefits from that particular transaction, depending on how the building is the lease is structured and how that building is structured, the person is going to be different. Sometimes leases are written such that the landlord controls the primary equipment and they own the meter effectively. And sometimes it's the tenant that controls the primary decisions and it owns the meter. But in every situation, there's a person that does. And so the way that you would, so in your case, if the landlord has that control over the money, then yeah, they're the ones who basically benefit from any energy savings. Frequently what we find is that, especially when we're dealing with owners and tenants and managers and brokers and all this messy situation, we forget to identify who's actually paying the bills. And the person who pays the bill is actually the one who cares the most. So they're the ones who actually have the most leverage and the control over that decision. But the first thing is find the person who paid the bill and convince them that they need to be more efficient. Yeah, go ahead.
It seems to me like when you're thinking about optimizing finances in the energy space, you probably feel like you have one hand tied behind your back in this area without time of use rates, because that would really provide financial incentive for a whole bunch of things. I think we don't have time of use rates here because of historically we've been powered by a lot of hydro capacity that we haven't really needed it. Seems like it's beginning to become more necessary. I'd just be interested to hear what you think about where we are and where we might be going in that area.
Well, it goes back to the question of power and energy. What are you trying to solve for? Are we trying to solve for a capacity issue, which is a power issue, kilowatt issue, or are we trying to solve for an energy issue? And time of use is really good for power issues, whereas here we're constrained on energy, which is one of the reasons why we don't have as much time of use pricing, is because we don't have the same problems. At the same time, with the way that we approach it, if you're spending $1 million on energy, I don't care who you are or what your rates are, you're wasting 30% of it. So it just means that the size of the businesses are going to be different based on where we go. But an interesting factoid as well, even though the cost of electricity, the rate of electricity is different across the US quite substantially, 40 cents in Hawaii per kilowatt hour, 6 cents here in some parts of the state, 10 cents here in Seattle. Yet, even though with all that difference, on average across the country, a household will spend about $80 to $100 per month What does that tell you? It tells you in places where the cost of electricity is higher, their buildings are more efficient and they consume less, right? So it's actually, I think, not a problem of the rate structure, it's a problem of how we consume it and what we're actually doing from the consumption side.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Casey.
Maybe to build on that, but do our utilities, at least the private utilities, rely on this waste as part of their business model being viable? And what's the connection there between that and all of our pension funds that are invested in their performance?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm friends with the utilities, so I don't want to angle. No, but no. In all honesty, it's one of those areas that I think we just don't think about and we don't talk about, which is one of the reasons why I like talking about it. Right? Utilities want their job, their mandate is to provide reliable power. Once again, going back to that's the product. And so how many different ways can they do that? One of the reasons why utilities have efficiency programs in general is because they realize that it is cheaper to buy future power from efficiency than to build a new power plant. And so in essence, it is in their business model to buy power from efficiency than it is to buy power from building a new power plant. And so, yeah, 30% is a huge amount of waste. I don't think any utility expects that 30% just to go away. And it takes a lot of effort, time to be able to put together these programs. And so, to a utility, for every kilowatt they don't have to produce, that's actually better for them in the way that they're financially set up. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
So you had mentioned that the cost of electricity has been pretty constant for the last few decades at like 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Do you think that is going to continue, or do you think, a lot of people, I see a lot of reading, or I read a lot of things that say, energy costs are going to zero, whether it's from renewables or green energy or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it'll stay constant. I don't think it's going to drop to zero because once again, it goes back to, are we buying energy or power? Yeah, the renewable energy part might be cheap or really low or really free, but we still have to keep the grid running. In order to keep the grid running, that takes 24 hours worth of effort to be able to do. That's not just a solar panel that comes on and off when the sun wants to shine. And so really, if we get into the way a utility is financially structured, it's to keep the infrastructure up and running and guaranteed to run at 99.98% uptime. That takes a lot of investment to be able to create that infrastructure. And so, yeah, we can come up with a different energy source, which could be incredibly low marginal costs to be able to put that energy source in, but we still have to keep that infrastructure running if we want to have access to electrons on demand. And so it'll probably stay about the same.
We're just a few weeks away from receiving ballots.
Uh-oh.
Would you share with us your best take, even your recommendations on Initiative 732? And
Yeah.
trade-offs, if we should be seeing trade-offs, against State Department of Ecology's declaration of a week ago about carbon regulation of major sources.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Happy to make a comment. So do you want to elaborate a little bit about 732? Sorry, I forget the number already.
No, it's not a personal cause.
Oh, okay.
But I care about it.
So there is a ballot measure in Washington State about creating a carbon tax. And carbon taxes, I actually spent an entire chapter on taxes, just because I think taxes are fascinating as a tool and a mechanism to get people to do things. So I will tell that story through a quick detour, if you don't mind. And the reason why taxes are so interesting to me is, let's think of how many levers we have to change behaviors in the masses. We have marketing as a way to get messaging out, but what if we used a tax as a way to change behavior? And there's lots of historical precedents of how taxes have changed behaviors. That's why in Denmark, in Amsterdam, you have buildings that are incredibly tall and narrow. It's because back in the day, they were taxed based on the width of their building, right? It's why in England you have buildings that have windows that are boarded over. It's because the wealthy were taxed based on the number of windows that they had inside of their building. And so if anything changes behaviors of the masses, it's a tax, right? So to me, the best impetus to get massive change is actually a tax, just because you'll do anything to avoid paying that bloody tax, right? And if it's tied to carbon in some sort of a way, that results in behaviors that'll do anything to get away from consuming carbon. So going back to that prioritization diagram, I think a tax is a great way for avoidance, right? Which I think is a much better strategy in general than going back to saying, well, now let's cap and trade or let's do something down here because we've already produced it on this other end. But a tax is actually incredibly effective in setting the right behaviors that then we can use to filter down the entire system. Now, how we gather that tax, how we spend that money, that's the political question. But in terms of, my personal preference between a tax and a cap and trade program, a tax is going to help us avoid, whereas cap and trade is going to help us manage. Two very different approaches. Does that answer your question?
And how about ecology's step of a week ago? Does that fit into the same equation for you?
If I'm to be perfectly honest, I'm not familiar with ecology's statement from a week ago, so I don't want to.
Understood.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just sort of a question about future employment or advice you would give to someone who is just starting out in a career. What kind of skills or college degrees will be in high demand in the changing energy industry?
That's a really good question. I love telling this a story the answer is anything. But let me tell you, the reason why the answer is anything is, there's a building owner who owned a building in Tacoma. It was one of those high-rise buildings, right? But the HVAC system that they had that ran the building, that heated and cooled the building, was an older system. It was always on or always off for the entire story, okay? And at the very top floor of this building was a 24-hour private club. And so because of that 24-hour tenant, they had to keep it warm and cool, and so they had to keep the entire HV system on for the entire building to satisfy the need of that one tenant. And so when the property manager didn't renew that lease, the energy consumption of that building dropped by 2/3. So if a property manager, by making a lease decision, could have such a large impact on energy, any job that we have has an impact on energy. We just don't think about it that way, right? And so, yeah, there are the engineering skills for sure that a utility needs, and the strategy and the public policy and the things that go inside of a utility. But, for us to decide to be sitting in this room today versus sitting at the Impact Hub versus sitting inside of a law office to do this program, all of that actually has different energy impacts too. But we don't really think about that in our daily decision making. And so if we can, that actually has a much larger impact, because once again, it goes back to the what are we actually trying to consume? Can I avoid it? Can I find other ways to satisfy it before I get into the how do I generate it? And so I think there's a lot of need for people inside businesses to just understand how they're consuming that energy, not just on the production side to be able to satisfy that need. So, does that answer your question?
Sort of, asking more like practically if someone's going to major in something, what they think about.
So as a major, the biggest mover probably is going to be policy. Because so much of energy and so much of these infrastructures span between municipalities and span between jurisdictions. And so the higher up you can go in terms of a public policy point of view, the larger of an impact you're going to have on the ground. Outside of that, finance, understanding how the money flows. The two things that you can always trace is, three things: flow of electrons, flow of money, and then the government policy that's driving the driving force. So those are the three things that I would think of understanding in depth and how it relates to energy. Cool. Well, I'll still be around. Thank you very much for the program. I'll still be around. And there are books for sale over there, and I think there are also pens. So if you want, I can sign a couple too. So thank you very much for your time.